as night settles quietly around you. This is a story not about heroes or villains, but about Loki, a figure misunderstood not because he was evil, but because he never fit into the shape the world demanded. Most tales remember Loki as a trickster, a bringer of chaos, a shadow moving between gods and disasters. But tonight's story moves more slowly than legend. It asks a gentler question. What happens to someone who is clever in a world that values strength? What becomes of a mind that sees too much, too early, and is punished not for malice, but for difference? This is not a story of betrayal told loudly. It is a story of belonging denied quietly. In this retelling, Loki is not defined by the end of the world, but by the long path that led there, the jokes that hid wounds, the schemes that replaced honesty, the loneliness that learned how to speak in mischief, because no one listened to it otherwise. Here on Slevor, stories are not told to excite or alarm, but to slow the mind and soften the edges of thought. So allow this story to unfold gently, without judgment, without expectation. If you find comfort in these quiet retellings of myth, you're welcome to like the video and subscribe to the channel, so more stories like this can find you on another night. Now let the world grow distant. The fire has burned low. The gods are listening less carefully, and Loki's story, the one rarely told, is about to begin. Loki was never meant to be simple. From the beginning, his existence resisted clean definition. He was born not into warmth or celebration, but into tension, into a world already divided between what was welcomed and what was merely tolerated. His origins lay far from the shining halls of Asgard, in a place the gods spoke of cautiously, as if naming it too clearly might invite instability. Jotunheim was a land of extremes, and Loki carried that inheritance quietly within him. When he first came among the Aesir, it was not through conquest or invitation, but through circumstance. Odin saw something in him that others did not yet recognize. Not strength of arm, but sharpness of mind. Loki noticed this immediately. He learned early that being seen did not mean being understood. He was clever before he was trusted. And trust, once delayed, rarely arrives intact. In Asgard, strength was admired openly. Honor was measured in visible acts. Battles fought, oaths kept, enemies defeated. Loki watched all of this from the edges, absorbing patterns, reading unspoken rules. He laughed when others laughed, but his laughter arrived a fraction too late, as though he were translating it before releasing it. This difference went unnoticed at first, or perhaps it was noticed, but dismissed as harmless. Loki learned quickly how to be useful. He solved problems no one else could. He spoke when others hesitated. He saw connections where others saw chaos. When plans failed, he improvised.
When pride threatened progress, he redirected it with humor.
The gods began to rely on him. And yet, reliance is not the same as belonging. At feasts, Loki was present, but rarely central. His words entertained, but his presence unsettled. He noticed how conversations softened when he approached, how compliments often arrived paired with caution. No one questioned his intelligence. They questioned his intent. This puzzled him. Loki did not see himself as deceptive. He saw himself as adaptive. In a world governed by rigid ideals, adaptation felt like survival. Thor, in contrast, embodied everything Loki was not. Strength without ambiguity. Action without hesitation. Where Thor moved forward, Loki moved sideways. Where Thor broke obstacles, Loki bypassed them. They traveled together often. Loki spoke, Thor acted. The balance worked until it didn't. Because admiration cast in shadow does not remain admiration for long. Loki began to sense that no matter how much he contributed, the story others told about him remained incomplete. His successes were treated as accidents, his mistakes as revelations. When something went wrong, eyes turned toward him first. This pattern shaped him more deeply than any single event. He learned that expectation can be heavier than blame, that once doubt settles into perception, even innocence feels suspicious. So he adapted again. If they expected unpredictability, he leaned into it. If they suspected mischief, he refined it. Humor became armor. Tricks became language. He began to test boundaries. Not out of malice, but curiosity. How far could he go before being rejected entirely? The gods responded with laughter, then warnings, then distance. Each reaction confirmed something Loki had already begun to believe, that his role had been decided long before he understood the rules. In quiet moments, he wondered who he might have been if his mind had been valued as much as a sword arm, if cleverness had been considered a virtue rather than a liability, if questions had been welcomed instead of feared. But Asgard was not a place that lingered on such considerations. It preferred clarity, certainty, heroes with defined edges. Loki did not have edges. He was fluid, observant, always changing shape. Not only in body, but in thought. This unsettled those who built identity on permanence. And so, slowly, subtly, Loki learned to perform. He exaggerated his wit, sharpened his sarcasm, turned insight into provocation. If he could not be trusted, he would at least be unforgettable. The danger of this choice revealed itself gradually. When you perform a role long enough, the role begins to perform you. The tricks grew more elaborate, the consequences more severe. Yet each time Loki crossed a line, part of him waited quietly for someone to stop him, not with punishment, but with understanding. No one did. They corrected the outcome, never the cause. They needed his mind when problems arose, but they did not want his perspective when it challenged comfort. They wanted solutions, not mirrors. Loki, ever perceptive, noticed the contradiction. And contradiction, when left unresolved, becomes resentment. Still, he remained. He stayed among them. He laughed louder than necessary. He offered help even when it went unappreciated. He played the part expected of him, refining it until it fit too well. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. Not anger, not yet. Disillusionment. He began to see that the order Asgard prized so highly was fragile, maintained not by truth, but by agreement. That chaos was not an invading force, but a natural response to imbalance. And if chaos was inevitable, perhaps it had a purpose. This thought did not arrive as a declaration, it arrived as a whisper, a possibility. Loki did not yet wish to tear anything down, but he had begun to wonder what might grow if things were allowed to fall apart. In the quiet hours, when the halls emptied and the fire dimmed, Loki felt the loneliness of someone surrounded by voices but unheard. He knew the gods spoke of destiny as something fixed, noble, and ordained, but no one had ever asked him what he believed destiny to be. If they had, he might have said this: that fate is often what happens when no one listens early enough. And with that unspoken belief, Loki stepped forward into the path that would define him. Not as a villain or a savior, but as something far more unsettling to the gods. A question they could no longer ignore. The story of Loki did not begin with betrayal. It began with exclusion. And from that quiet beginning, everything else would follow. As time passed, Loki's presence in Asgard became both familiar and uneasy. He was no longer the newcomer from a distant land, yet he was never allowed to forget that he was not entirely of this one. The gods had grown accustomed to his voice in their councils, his laughter at their feasts, his solutions when problems grew inconvenient. But familiarity did not bring closeness. It brought assumption. They assumed he would fix what broke. They assumed he would bend rules when rules failed. They assumed, above all, that if something went wrong, Loki would be nearby. This expectation shaped the way he moved through the world. He began to notice how often his name was spoken before his actions were considered. When success followed his plans, it was credited to fortune or to the strength of others. When consequences appeared, his cleverness was suddenly described as recklessness. Loki learned the language of double standards without anyone teaching it to him. At first, he tried to correct the imbalance with reason. He explained his thinking, outlined his intentions, clarified the choices that led to each outcome. But explanations, he discovered, are fragile things. They require patience from the listener. Patience was in short supply. Over time, Loki stopped explaining. Instead, he observed. He watched how easily fear disguised itself as righteousness, how quickly order was defended, not because it was just, but because it was familiar. The gods spoke of balance, yet clung to hierarchies that served them well. And Loki, ever perceptive, saw the cracks forming long before they were acknowledged. He noticed how Odin's wisdom carried the weight of sacrifice, yet demanded it mostly from others. He saw how Thor's strength was celebrated, even when it caused collateral harm. He observed how rules were applied strictly until power required flexibility. These observations did not harden him immediately. They saddened him, because Loki had wanted to belong to this world. He had wanted to believe that cleverness, when paired with loyalty, could earn trust. That difference could coexist with tradition. But Asgard was not built for that. Its stories preferred simplicity, heroes and threats, light and shadow. Loki existed in between. And in between is where stories struggle to place meaning. The first time Loki acted against expectation, it was subtle. A choice made without consultation.
a solution that revealed a flaw rather than concealing it. The gods reacted with discomfort, not outrage. Discomfort was worse.
It meant they sensed truth in what he had done, but did not wish to engage with it. Loki felt something tighten in his chest. Not anger, but resolve. If truth unsettled them, perhaps they needed to be unsettled. From then on, his actions grew more deliberate. Still clever, still effective, but increasingly provocative. He began to design outcomes that forced the gods to confront consequences they preferred to ignore. When faced with disorder, Asgard always sought restoration. Loki began to wonder whether restoration was always the right answer. Sometimes disruption reveals rot. This line of thinking changed the way he viewed his own role. He stopped seeing himself as a helper and started seeing himself as a catalyst. Not a destroyer, but a test. If the system was sound, it would survive examination. If it was not, then perhaps it deserved to fail. These were dangerous thoughts, and Loki knew it. But danger, he had learned, was relative. To the gods, danger meant loss of control. To Loki, danger meant remaining silent while imbalance hardened into permanence. He began to take risks, not recklessly but intentionally. He set small events in motion and watched how quickly they escalated. How easily the gods blamed one another. How rarely they questioned the structure that encouraged such conflict. Each experiment taught him something. Power, he realized, was not held solely by the strongest. It was distributed through narrative, through who was believed, who was forgiven, who was remembered kindly. And Loki, for all his cleverness, was not granted narrative mercy. This realization cut deeper than any rebuke. It meant that no matter how carefully he acted, his intentions would be rewritten by others, that his story would never belong to him. Faced with this, Loki made a choice, quiet, irreversible. If he could not control how he was perceived, he would control what was revealed. His mischief sharpened into exposure. His tricks became mirrors. He spoke truths disguised as jokes, knowing laughter was the only way some things could be heard. But each time he did, the distance between him and the others grew. They laughed, but they stopped trusting. They relied, but they withdrew affection. They accepted his usefulness, but denied his humanity. Loki felt the isolation deepen. Not dramatically, not all at once. It settled slowly, like cold. He began to spend more time alone, walking the edges of Asgard where order thinned and silence stretched longer. In those spaces, he allowed himself to think freely. What if the chaos he represented was not the problem, but the symptom? What if Asgard's stability required someone to challenge it, someone willing to be blamed? The thought frightened him, because it felt true. He did not yet see himself as an antagonist. He still hoped for correction, for dialogue, for understanding. But hope, when unreciprocated, curdles. And Loki was beginning to feel it turn. The gods, sensing the shift, grew cautious. They spoke of him more often in warning tones. They placed boundaries around his actions without acknowledging the reasons. This only confirmed his suspicion that he was no longer seen as part of the solution. He was being reclassified. And once a role is assigned, escape becomes difficult.
Loki understood that something fundamental had changed, not because of a single act of betrayal, but because of accumulated distance, misunderstanding layered upon assumption, assumption hardened into judgment. The path ahead was narrowing, and though he could not yet see where it led, he felt its direction. The world was preparing to name him, and when it did, the name would stick. Because stories, once decided, resist revision. Loki stood at the edge of that realization, aware that whatever came next would not be forgiven as easily as what came before. Still, he did not step back, because stepping back would have meant accepting silence. And silence, he knew, had already done enough damage. So he moved forward, not in rage, not in cruelty, but with a growing certainty that the truth he carried would not remain hidden much longer. Even if revealing it meant becoming the thing the gods feared most. The next turning would not be subtle. It would be remembered. And Loki, for the first time, would be unable to pretend he did not understand the cost. The shift, when it came, did not announce itself with thunder or flame. It arrived quietly, in the way glances linger a moment too long, in the way conversations pause when one voice enters the room. Loki felt it in the subtle recalibration of the world around him. He was no longer merely watched. He was anticipated. Expectation once again pressed against him, but now it was sharpened by suspicion. The gods began to interpret his presence as a variable that needed managing. Plans were adjusted with him in mind. Outcomes were assessed by how much room they left for his influence. Loki noticed this with a clarity that was both painful and precise. He had become a contingency, not an ally, not a threat, something to account for. This realization settled into him slowly. He did not react with anger, he reacted with attentiveness. If he was being studied, then he would study back. And what he saw unsettled him. Asgard prided itself on order, but the order was sustained by avoidance. Conflicts were deferred rather than resolved. Questions were postponed until they could be reframed as certainties. The gods spoke of unity while carefully maintaining distance from anything that complicated it. Loki had once tried to bring complexity into the open. Now he understood why it had been rejected. Complexity demands responsibility, and responsibility, when shared, dilutes power. The more he observed, the more he recognized that Asgard's stability was less about balance and more about control. The rules were flexible, but only in one direction. The hierarchy was justified, but rarely examined. This was not corruption in the dramatic sense. It was something quieter. Comfort masquerading as virtue. Loki did not set out to dismantle it. He still hoped in some small unguarded part of himself that exposure would lead to correction, that once contradictions were visible, they would be addressed. So he began to speak more plainly, not loudly, not confrontationally, but with clarity that left little room for misinterpretation. He asked questions that did not accuse, but could not be ignored. Why is this rule enforced here, but not there? Why is this act forgiven, while another is condemned? Who benefits from the way things are, and who bears the cost? The response was predictable. Deflection, humor, gentle reprimand, warnings disguised as concern. Loki was advised to be careful, to remember his place, to trust in the wisdom of those who had always led. These suggestions carried an unspoken message. Do not disturb the shape of things. For the first time, Loki felt anger. Not explosive, but sharp and focused. Not directed at a person, but at a pattern. He saw how easily truth could be framed as disruption, and disruption as danger. This was the moment when mischief transformed into intention. If questions were unwelcome, perhaps answers would be forced. Loki began to construct situations that revealed truth through consequence. He introduced variables into systems that had grown too rigid to adapt. He did not lie, he did not coerce. He simply removed the safety nets. When outcomes became uncomfortable, the gods responded as they always had, by looking for someone to blame. And Loki, standing openly at the center of it, did not step aside. He allowed the blame to land. This was not martyrdom. It was demonstration. By accepting the role they were eager to assign him, he exposed the mechanism beneath it, the speed with which judgment formed, the ease with which complexity was flattened into guilt. The gods grew uneasy. Some sensed the trap and resented him for it. Others admired his cleverness but feared association. A few began to avoid him entirely, as though distance could absolve complicity. Thor, more than anyone, struggled to understand what was happening. He saw Loki's actions as unnecessary provocation. To him, problems were meant to be faced directly, not reframed. He urged Loki to stop testing the limits, to accept the structure that had served them for generations. Loki listened. And then he asked a question that Thor could not answer. Who has the structure served? The silence that followed was heavy. Not because Thor did not care, but because he had never been asked to think that way before. Strength had shielded him from needing to. This, Loki realized, was the true divide between them. Not morality, but perspective. Not loyalty, but awareness. Loki did not hate Thor. If anything, he mourned the simplicity Thor had been allowed to keep. The next step in Loki's transformation was not dramatic. It was deliberate. He began to prepare, not for revenge, but for inevitability. He knew now that Asgard would not change willingly, that the system required an antagonist to define itself against, and that role, whether he accepted it or not, was already being written for him. If he was to be cast as chaos, then he would define what that chaos revealed. He studied the foundations of Asgard, its myths, its symbols, the narratives that held it together. He identified the moments where belief outweighed reality, where tradition masked fragility. And quietly, carefully, he began to apply pressure. Each act was calibrated, each consequence intentional. He did not seek collapse, he sought revelation. But revelation, when it arrives without consent, feels like violence. The gods responded with fear. Fear hardened into hostility. They no longer asked why Loki acted as he did. They focused on how to contain him. Restrictions were discussed. Surveillance increased. His freedom narrowed. Loki felt the walls closing in, and with them, the final illusion dissolved. He had believed for too long that understanding could be achieved through patience, that proximity would lead to empathy, that if he stayed, eventually he would be heard. Now he saw the truth. Understanding was never the goal. Stability was. And stability, once threatened, defends itself ruthlessly. This knowledge did not break him. It clarified him. Loki stopped seeking approval, stopped hoping for reconciliation. He did not renounce Asgard, but he no longer imagined a place within it. The path ahead was no longer about choice. It was about alignment. He could either continue to soften his edges, shrink his questions, and live as a tolerated anomaly, or he could step fully into the role that was forming around him and force the world to confront what it had built. This was not a decision made in anger. It was made in lucidity. Loki understood that once he crossed this threshold, there would be no return to ambiguity. He would be named, remembered, simplified. But perhaps simplification was inevitable. Perhaps clarity required sacrifice. And so, with a calm that surprised even himself, Loki began to move toward the moment where intention would become consequence, where mischief would become meaning, where the story would no longer be about fitting in, but about revealing what happened. When a system refuses to listen until it is too late. By the time Loki stepped into what would later be remembered as his fourth turning, he no longer mistook clarity for peace. Understanding had brought him calm, but it had also stripped away comfort. Once illusions dissolve, they do not return. The world does not soften to reward awareness. It sharpens. Asgard had begun to respond. Not openly, not yet, but through subtle measures that carried unmistakable intent. Invitations stopped arriving. Decisions were made without his presence. Information reached him late, altered, or not at all. Loki noticed everything. Exclusion, he had learned, was rarely loud. It worked best when it felt reasonable, when those enforcing it could convince themselves it was for the greater good. They told themselves they were maintaining balance. Balance, Loki knew, was another word for preservation. And preservation always asks the same question. Preserved for whom? He moved through the golden halls with the awareness of someone already half remembered. The laughter that once greeted him now sounded cautious. Conversations ended as he approached, then resumed with polite distance once he passed. It would have been easier if they had confronted him directly. Easier, perhaps, if they had accused him openly. But avoidance was their chosen language. And Loki was fluent in silence. During this time he withdrew, not in bitterness, but in preparation. He spent long hours alone, tracing the logic of Asgard's myths, examining the stories the gods told themselves about who they were and why they ruled. He saw how narratives functioned as architecture, how belief reinforced hierarchy, how the past was curated to justify the present. Loki understood then that Asgard was not held together by strength alone. It was held together by agreement. Agreement that certain voices mattered more than others, that some truths were dangerous, that order once established should not be questioned by those who benefited least from it. This realization did not ignite a desire to destroy. It ignited a desire to expose. If Asgard was as just as it claimed, it would withstand scrutiny. If it was not, then no amount of silence would save it. Loki did not yet see himself as the enemy, but he had begun to accept that he would be treated as one regardless. So he stopped trying to appear harmless. Instead, he became precise. Each action he took was measured, intentional, impossible to dismiss as accident. He spoke less, but when he did, his words landed with weight. He no longer softened his insights with humor or deflection. This unsettled the gods more than his mischief ever had. A trick can be laughed away. A truth, spoken calmly, lingers. Odin watched him closely during this time. The Allfather had always understood Loki better than most, had recognized his intelligence, his adaptability, his danger. But even Odin hesitated now, because Loki was no longer unpredictable. He was consistent. And consistency in opposition is far more threatening than chaos. Odin attempted conversation. Not confrontation, but caution. He spoke of responsibility, of legacy, of the fragile equilibrium that sustained their world. He warned Loki of consequences, not as threats, but as inevitabilities. Loki listened with respect, and then he asked a question that shifted something between them. If equilibrium depends on silence, is it worth sustaining? Odin did not answer immediately. In that pause, Loki saw the truth reflected back at him. Even wisdom has boundaries it refuses to cross. From that moment on, Loki knew that no authority in Asgard would intervene on his behalf. Not because they did not understand him, but because understanding him required change. And change is always more frightening than collapse. The gods began to tighten their grip. Rules were formalized, roles clarified, deviations discouraged. Loki's movements were monitored under the guise of protection. They told themselves they were preventing disorder. Loki recognized it as containment. And containment, he knew, is the final step before confrontation. He did not resist. Resistance would have confirmed their fears too quickly. Instead, he waited. Waiting for Loki was not passive. It was strategic. He observed the stress lines forming beneath Asgard's polished surface. He noticed how quickly unity fractured under pressure, how often power protected itself before addressing harm. The gods spoke often now of external threats, of enemies beyond their borders, of dangers that justified internal control. Loki recognized the pattern. Fear always looks outward first. He began to see his role with painful clarity. He was no longer simply a participant in Asgard's story. He had become a necessary contrast, a figure through which order defined itself. If he were removed, the illusion of harmony could persist a while longer. If he remained, tension would continue to grow. Neither outcome was gentle. This knowledge weighed on him. not as guilt, but as inevitability. He had not chosen this position freely. It had been shaped by years of misunderstanding, projection, and deferred reckoning. Still, he did not absolve himself. He knew that intention did not erase consequence. He knew that some of what he had set in motion would cause pain. That exposure is not a clean process. That truth, when forced into the open, cuts indiscriminately. But he also knew this: silence would cost more. As the final conditions began to align, Loki felt something he had not felt in a long time. Resolve. Not the reckless resolve of youth, eager to prove itself, but the quiet resolve of someone who understands the cost and chooses the path anyway. He no longer sought to be understood. He sought to be accurate. If the gods needed a figure to embody disruption, he would ensure that disruption revealed meaning rather than mere destruction. If he was to be cast as the problem, he would make certain the problem could not be ignored. The stage was nearly set. The gods sensed it, though they did not yet know how to name it. Conversations grew tense. Alliances shifted subtly. Preparations were made on all sides. Asgard was bracing itself, and Loki, standing at the center of that anticipation, felt neither triumph nor fear. Only clarity. The understanding that the next step would not be reversible. That whatever followed would redefine him forever. That the world would simplify his motives, reduce his complexity, and remember him as a warning. He accepted this. Because complexity, once sacrificed, does not return. But meaning sometimes survives the simplification. And Loki was no longer willing to protect a world that demanded his silence as the price of belonging. The next act would not be playful. It would not be ambiguous. It would be remembered as betrayal. But Loki knew the truth beneath that word. Sometimes what is called betrayal is simply the moment when patience runs out, and truth refuses to remain hidden any longer. The moment Loki crossed into what would later be remembered as his fifth turning, the world began to respond more loudly. Not with understanding, not with dialogue, but with reaction. Asgard, having tolerated ambiguity for as long as it could, now demanded definition. The gods no longer spoke in hints or cautions, they spoke in conclusions. Loki's actions were no longer discussed as troubling. They were named. And once something is named, it stops being questioned. Loki felt the shift immediately. The air itself seemed to tighten, as though the space around him had grown wary. Guards watched him without pretense. Decisions were made in rooms he no longer entered. His presence was treated as provocation. He was not surprised. In some quiet part of himself, he had expected this long before it arrived. What unsettled him was not the condemnation, but the speed with which it settled into certainty. Years of loyalty, contribution, and restraint dissolved beneath a handful of moments reframed as proof. This, Loki realized, was the cost of existing outside a simple narrative. Complexity does not survive fear. The gods began to speak of protection, of necessity, of the danger posed by unchecked cleverness. They cited incidents stripped of context, outcomes divorced from intention. They told themselves a story in which Loki had always been this way. This was easier than admitting that the world they had built could not accommodate him. Loki listened to these accounts from a distance, his expression unreadable. He felt no urge to defend himself. Defense assumes the possibility of fairness. That possibility had passed. Instead, he turned inward. He examined his own actions with the same clarity he had once applied to Asgard. He did not excuse himself. He acknowledged where curiosity had become provocation, where exposure had become harm. But he also refused to accept the erasure of motive. He had not acted to destroy. He had acted to reveal. That distinction mattered to him, even if it mattered to no one else. As the pressure increased, Loki felt a strange calm settle over him. The uncertainty that had once haunted him had finally resolved. The world had chosen its version of him. And once chosen, it could no longer be negotiated. This clarity freed him. He stopped moderating his presence, stopped softening his words. He spoke plainly now, not to persuade, but to record. If history would remember him as a threat, then at least the truth would exist somewhere beneath the surface. Some of the gods avoided him entirely. Others confronted him with anger thinly disguised as righteousness. A few looked at him with something close to regret, as if recognizing too late the role they had played in his isolation. Thor was among them. Their meeting during this time was quiet, heavy with things neither could say easily. Thor spoke of loyalty, of brotherhood, of lines that should not be crossed. Loki listened. And then he asked softly whether loyalty required silence. Thor did not answer. He could not. Strength had never demanded that kind of introspection from him. The distance between them widened, not through conflict, but through incapacity. They stood on opposite sides of an understanding that could not be bridged by affection alone. Loki felt the loss sharply. Not because Thor had chosen Asgard, but because Asgard had never asked Thor to choose differently. As events continued to unfold,
as the story of Loki slowly fades, there is nothing left to resolve. No final judgment, no last struggle, only the quiet understanding that some truths are meant to linger, not to be answered, but to be felt. Here on Sleever, stories are told not to awaken the mind, but to gently guide it toward rest, to let complexity soften, to let thought loosen its grip. If this journey through Loki's life brought you a sense of calm, or simply kept you company in the quiet of the night, you're welcome to like the video and subscribe to the channel, so these gentle stories can return to you again. For now, allow the world to drift further away. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts grow lighter. There is nothing you need to hold on to. Sleep will come on its own. Good night, and may your rest be deep and peaceful.